gods, what happened? And why do I feel so tired? Galeth murmured to himself after finally regaining consciousness. He tried to recall the hours leading up to his brief dance with death. But alas, the only memories the weakened Enowayan managed to conjure up were a blurry string of vague shapes and indistinguishable sounds. He remembered being led somewhere after trying to lay down for a bit. Then someone had hooked him up to some sort of strange machine that had done something to him. He could vaguely recall hearing the term germ-bleached before ending up in this strange white room. Where am I? Am I dead? He tried to get up, but quickly found that he'd barely had enough strength to lift his head, never mind the rest of his body. Just as he was about to struggle and scream for help, he heard a dull click. Someone had entered the room. She was Enowayan, just like him. She seemed familiar. Had he met her before? No, wait, she was part of the crew. Yes, I was part of an expedition, and then... Gaians! Suddenly, realization struck him as Galeth's still somewhat fatigued and painkiller-addled mind began to put the pieces together. I was gravely wounded, and then someone brought me to He felt his heart pound rapidly. His gaze instinctively darted from one corner of the room to the other, all while starting to hyperventilate. Despair washed over him. He felt trapped, as if his fate was sealed and any moment now someone would come and end his feeble existence. Fantasizing about Lovecraftian dommy-mommies on the holonet was one thing, but then to actually get captured and potentially eaten by one. "Oh gods, I'm such an idiot!" he chastised himself. "No, this isn't right. This isn't fair. I have to get out of here. I have to escape." Using every ounce of energy he still had left, Galeth tried to get up once again, only to be stopped by who he assumed was the one who'd brought him into this mess in the first place. "Don't move. You're still too weak," she informed him kindly. "Look, I know how you feel, but trust me, everything will be fine. You're safe here. No one is going to harm you. But what about... Look, I know they seem scary and all, but you're not dead, are you?" "Well, no, but..." "Good, keep that in mind, 'cause it was the Gaians that made sure you'd stay that way. You quite literally owe them your life, and well, to a lesser extent me too, I guess, since I helped bring you here," she remarked with an arrogant smirk. "Well, yeah, I suppose I do feel fit." Suddenly Galeth froze as his eyes darted to the humanoid face that was now peering in through a crack in the door. It curiously ogled the two of them through bespectacled eyes. "Ah, yes, I've taken the liberty of calling that one Touchy, since she can't help but touch us constantly and talks to us in a much more high-pitched voice than when they're talking to the other Gaians," she said as Stella, upon noticing that she'd been spotted, flung the door open and quickly walked over to the two Enowayans. I know, it takes some getting used to, but they're not as dangerous as they might appear," Reka advised him. "Having said that, though, I'd advise against looking at them directly for extended periods of time. Otherwise, you might get a headache or become nauseous. Oh, and don't stare directly into their eyes. Once you do, it gets tricky to look away." At that moment, the ponytailed Gaian began to gently pet and scratch Reka's back. "Ah, that's the spot," she softly muttered to herself. "Don't get me wrong. Technically, they're still eldritch abominations, stains upon reality that defy the laws of nature and deserve our contempt," she said while closing her eyes in euphoria, as Stella continued to diligently pet her. "But frankly, I think they're pretty neat, and we should probably just leave 'em be. Besides, if the gods really want them gone that badly, they can just send us some signs or do it themselves." But they're supposed to be evil. What if they're trying to trick us?" Galeth remarked. "Well, then I gotta get one to trick me all the way to retirement on a bi-daily basis. Look, I feel like you Galeth's no doubt impressively worded rebuttal was cut short as Stella, who now had stopped coddling Reka, took a step closer to the male Enowayan and began to mercilessly hug him. Galeth felt conflicted. On one hand, he was afraid that the Gaian might suddenly eat or crush him, perhaps even both at the same time, but on the other, this Gaian was firmly holding him against her bosom while caressing his back, something he'd perversely fantasized about not too long ago. "God damn it, Stella! Again!" A second Gaian had just walked into the room and was yelling at Touchy in his native tongue, who, with a nervous fear in her eyes, responded by quickly letting go of Galeth and taking a step back. The one standing in the doorway was holding some sort of archaic lock that had been broken and was staring accusatorily at its kinsman. To the two Enoweans, it seemed as if Touchy was trying to verbally defend her actions, or was at least trying to come up with a believable enough excuse. Alas, her pleas fell on deaf ears. The one in the doorway wasn't having any of it, and beckoned for her to leave the room, to which Touchy responded by grabbing the bed frame and using her best puppy dog eyes. Having had enough of her antics, the stern-looking Gaian sighed before grabbing something from his bag. In one hand, he was holding a fluffy doll representing some sort of cute quadruped creature, and in the other, a blowtorch. To Touchy's horror, the other Gaian began to threateningly wiggle the device's nozzle in front of the stuffed animal's face. She let out an ear-piercing shriek before rushing over to save the poor, inanimate object. Having successfully diverted Touchy's attention towards something she can't accidentally break with love and affection, the Gaian man threw the doll as hard as he could down the hallway. As soon as Touchy, who now looked slightly more feral, crossed the threshold, the lab coat-wearing Gaian hastily closed the door behind himself. A wise decision, especially since Reika is the reason that HR personnel avoid walking too closely to the airlocks. He walked over to Galeth and began to gently examine him, while also ignoring the frantic banging on the door. Galeth theorized that the Gaians must have studied Reika's physiology, and that the one in front of him was now estimating his overall health based on what they'd figured out about hers. A much more rational and intelligent course of action than the Enoweans would have expected. Then again, that appeared to be the case for most facts they'd been told about these cosmic horrors. What did strike Galeth as odd was that the Gaian seemed to have quite a few burns, one above his right eye, 2 on his hands, and 1 on his neck. Reika must have seen him staring, cause after letting out a soft cough to divert his attention, she began to explain certain unfortunate developments that had happened in his absence. Having lost a couple screws, the captain and whichever crew members were still willing to follow him had begun what was essentially a suicidal witch hunt. They'd hunted down and fired on any and all Gaians still roaming their ship. Based on the fact that none of the Gaians who Reika had seen were covered in blood, only burns, she'd figured that most, if not all of them, had refused to fight back, and instead opted to return to their vessel peacefully as well as hastily. Although she did remember one of them returning with what appeared to be an injured foot. As she told him this, Galeth winced. He really hoped that said Gaian had simply stubbed their toe. "So then what happens now?" Galeth asked, to which Reika threw up her hands and shrugged. "Honestly, I wasn't sure you'd wake up, and for as far as I could tell, neither did the Gaians. But now that you mention it, I'd say we go out there and show the others you're still alive." "You think that's a good idea? What if the Gaians are evil after all? Or what if the captain and his men think we're mindless thralls and shoot us on sight?" Galeth asked nervously. "Well, I suppose that'd be dreadfully inconvenient. But let's face it, we can't stay here forever, and I fear that brokering peace between the Gaians and our own kind might be the only choice we've got. Also, I'm sure as shit not leaving without one of these big boys. Maybe I can get one to stay with me. Ooh, and maybe I can teach them some tricks," Reika said before beckoning for the doctor to come and pet her just like Touchy had done. The Gaian blew air out of its mouth, which Galeth took as annoyed resignation before moving a little closer and caressing Reika's back lazily. "You know you sound completely crazy right now, right?" Galeth remarked. "Well, yeah, but to be fair, according to the Holy Scriptures, you'd have to beat a bargain with Gaia's children. That being said, I'd sell my soul if it means getting pampered like this every day." Back in the supply closet turned war room, the captain kept busy writing down his findings while remotely delegating what remained of his troops. Most of those yellow-belly cowards had deserted after their initial counterattack had failed. He'd even overheard some murmured gossip criticizing his infallible holy blood theory. Well, what did they know? He and the brave few who'd seen reason had already managed to push the Gaians back to their ship, including an already transformed Galeth. Poor kid. He'd forever remember him. His bravest soldier. He'd rather go into exile than risk putting his kinsmen in danger. Not like those cowards who'd fled with their tails behind their legs just because the Gaians shrugged off a couple photon bolts. Soon those sniffling cretins would come crawling back asking for protection, he was sure of that. "Now then, here goes nothing," the captain murmured to himself while pressing send on his newly made report. It contained everything he'd learned about the Gaians, and once it reached civilized space, everyone would know the Enoweans were the chosen race, the supreme beings, vanquishers of the horrors lurking in the deepest depths of the abyss. It in detail described how Enowean blood was considerably more holy than that of the other races, and that this was hinted at in one of their species' holy texts. Written thousands of years ago and translated only a couple dozen times. It mentioned how photon bolts, while non-lethal, frightened them, or how getting scratched or bitten by one would turn you into one such monster. And of course it mentioned how he and his crew bravely fought of these apostles of death and destruction.